couldn't give an invitation to it. Granting visas at consulates can also be very arbitrary because the visa process can't begin too early because some visas have short expiration time. So that's one of the tricky things too. You can't just, for a lot of countries, you can't give a visa for the next year. You have like a short window, and there's a process between that going on. And we wouldn't want them to expire before they were here. We also know that we have been unable to authorize credentials of some persons that were elected provisionally. And this was the great thing that happened on the floor of General Conference, which I'm going to get to some more details about that in a second. But we made first the credentials wanted to wait 48 hours to credential all the people who had been elected provisionally. And the floor said, no, we want it today. We want this to happen today. Anybody who has been elected, we want them to participate. And it took place. And so, so then all the delegates who had been, again, like elected provisionally had done that. But so that, I just wanted to talk about who was present at General Conference. So it was, I think it was about 862 were officially invited and that kind of thing as delegates, and a little under 800 eventually showed up at every point. Now this was a 10-day meeting, and so many of the days lasted 8 hours. So not everybody participated in every vote. So some different votes had different levels of that. But the main, I'm going to speak about my own experience first. And my own experience of it was incredible to have the conversations with Christians around the world. So I had many, many conversations with especially Christians and pastors in the Democratic Republic of Congo, different areas of the Congo. That there's an area in the DRC called North Katanga that's in the far southeast portion, if you can imagine, but in the far southeast. There's so many wonderful like dresses and suits made with this fabric print that had like the picture of John Wesley or different things like that people were walking around and wearing. And again, there's a big presence in Angola, and Angola is one of the official languages is Portuguese. So that's why Portuguese is one of the official languages in the United Methodist Church. So that was a lot that was going on there as well. And I also spent a lot of time with delegates from Europe, from Eastern Europe. That my wife her father lives in Hungary, and I've met some pastors in Hungary, and so I met with the delegates from Hungary. And it was so life-giving. It was so life-giving to speak with them, to pray with them. I met with some delegates from Finland, England in the 19th century. And the Finland-Swedish conference is closer to the border of Sweden, and there's been missionaries from Sweden went over. So all of that was really beautiful and powerful. And I want to start there, and I'll get to the sexuality stuff and LGBT stuff and that kind of thing, but I need to start with regionalization, because what happened early on in the first week is a petition which was passed, which put forward as the United Methodist Church as a set of regional churches. So right now, before it's all passed, there's the United States, it has 5 jurisdictions, and then there's central conferences that are all the other areas in the world. Again, it's like areas in Africa, Europe, and the Philippines. And so if there's something going on in Europe, they have the kind of way to deal with that. And a lot of this comes down to property laws, because property laws are different in different parts of the world, right? And so one of the historic aspects of the United Methodist Church has been what's called the trust clause, that we hold our churches in trust with one another. And the trust clause functions differently in other areas. But what has happened over the years is that, so, basically the pension plan in Finland is decided by the Finns, and they decide what their pension plan is. But for the U.S. church, everybody around the world has to vote on the pension plan. And one of the things that happened at this conference was they went from a defined pension to a mushy-gushy pension. But that happened. There was like a day when I didn't have a pension, which was annoying. But all the people around the world were voting on that. And I even talked to the delegates from Hungary and Finland, and they were like, we don't know what's going on. And so they were just like flipping coins to vote in some kind of ways, because it didn't affect them at all. It was about just a U.S. central thing. So the first thing the major shift that happened was that it was passed that the U.S. is going to be its own region, as on the same level playing field as the other central conferences. And so there's not going to be this U.S. focus, U.S.-centric idea of the United Methodist Church. And so if there's something that has to do just with the U.S. church, like pension plans, like those kinds of things, it would be addressed in a separate meeting than gathering all of the worldwide Methodists together. Okay, so this is something that came up originally at the end of 2019 out of the Philippines. It was this covenant called the Christmas Covenant, this gathering of Central Conference bishops of trying to figure out how to be a church together. And it finally got through. And part of what happened there is to give, the center of it is there's missional differences around the world. And so understanding that we have the power to affect our missional context. And so that was the first major thing that happened. And it happened pretty early on, and it happened pretty broadly. Okay, but I think it's really important because what happens next is impacted by regionalization, impacted by what areas can do in their own situation. So the major news item that wasn't regionalization, I don't think there wasn't a big CNN story about regionalization, was there? It was about taking out language of prohibiting LGBT clergy in the Book of Discipline. And eventually there was also taken out language that prohibited gay marriage in churches and prohibited pastors from performing those ceremonies. And I say take out, and this is the important thing, and this is the kind of communication thing that I feel like wasn't presented enough, is that in 1972 there was language that was put into the discipline that against same-sex or homosexual clergy. And so that began in 1972. So what happened at General Conference was they took out language that entered the discipline in 1972. And if you've been a Methodist longer than a month, there's been conflict over the years at annual conferences, at general conferences over this. That I think I went to, or I was with some people who had been to many general conferences, and they were saying how surprised they were to not see as many protests as usual, to not see as much activism as usual. But the thing that happened wasn't a positive addition to the discipline around sexuality. There was stuff taken out. And so it was put in language that pastors can't be punished for performing a wedding or not performing a wedding, no matter who they are going to marry. I like giving that my protection to not marry people, because I like having that ability to be like, I don't know about you guys. You're not really ready for it. But it's also, what also came out, so again, so nothing positive in this aspect was taken in. What is left is that annual conferences have the power to decide who can be ordained. And local churches and pastors have the power to decide who can be married in those contexts. And if somebody if someone shows the gifts in this kind of way, that we leave each annual conference the authority to ordain who they see fit for ministry. And we leave it to individual churches. And what was explicitly, in the structure of the United Methodist Church, there's also this kind of there's bishops, there's a general conference, and then there's this third body that kind of is analogous to the U.S. government and the three forms of government as the Judicial Council. And the Judicial Council is kind of like the Supreme Court. It is the Supreme Court of the United States, of the United Methodist Church. And they had a ruling that said that each, a local church, a board of trustees, will be able to make policy around marriage in their church, around what they see fit in that kind of way. And they also, right, and so, but it's also in that, and that churches will also churches will not be forced to receive a pastor that they're uncomfortable with in this kind of way. So it actually, like a church will not be forced to have a gay pastor if they do not want a gay pastor and that kind of thing. It's not this kind of affirmative action towards sexuality that is going on, which was in the explicit language of that ruling, and kind of, anyways, it alters itineracy in slightly a different way and gives local churches a little more authority in that process. But that's a little weedsy for us. And so again, I just want to emphasize on this aspect. What was taken out was restrictions of the general church that limited what local churches can do and limited what annual conferences can do. And sexuality was the only limiting factor that the general church did. And so in the discipline from basically 1972 until 2024, the only thing that could bar you from ministry was your sexual practice. Anything else goes. It doesn't matter what else sin is going on. It's the judgment of the annual conference, but that's the only sin that would bar you from ministry. in this kind of way, or bar that marriage. And whatever happens in all these kinds of ways, like the way the discipline was structured, it like structured a sexual sin as greater than any others. And I felt like that was really problematic theologically of lifting in this kind of way. Okay, there were a few other things that happened. One other aspect of, and again, if you have other questions, if you have questions for me, please grab a card from Brenda, and I can hopefully try and clarify in this kind of way. There was a new set of social principles that was put into the discipline. Now, the social principles started in 1908 as the social creed, and the history matters. And again, like if you ever want to hear more intricate history about the Methodist Church, you can listen to my podcast, The History of Methodism. It's the only one on the history of Methodism. There's no other competition, so it goes into a lot of detail. So I'm kind of a nerd on it, and so I think it matters. That in 1908, the social creed was first published, and this was in 1908, one of the few things both churches agreed on tremendously, because pretty soon after the social creed was approved in the ME Church, the ME South also approved it. And this was a statement, a lot of it had to do with like solidarity with workers, that it was like in this kind of the nascent labor movement, before there was a 40-hour work week, before there was a ban on child labor. It was like the Methodist Church way. And over the years, it's adapted and turned from a creed to principles, which I think makes good. I think there's only like two things, but so it adapted. And so, but the social principles take a big chunk of the beginning of the discipline, and they have to do with language around the economy, language around the environment, language around politics, language around how should we think theologically about the world we live in. It takes in a place in the discipline of the United Methodist Church right after a really beautiful statement on theology, on what we believe as a church, and our doctrinal statement, which is really, it was written by one of my former teachers, but it's a really beautiful description about how we can think about God. So then we get to the social principles. Now, they were, over the last 16 years, there's been a team that's been revising those, and revising them in a worldwide fashion. And so with people from all over the connection, and that's the kind of the Methodist lingo we talk about, all over the connection, people in Africa, in Europe, in the Philippines, all over the States, working together to put this language together. And so one of the other controversial thing that came out was there was language about marriage in this document. And it was amended from the floor, which is, again, there's a body of like 800 people. I got by the end of the time, I went through this process of every time someone said, I stand to speak for an amendment, I was like, oh no. Because every time someone amends something, where people would amend by substitution. So there'd be a debate on the floor, and it's like, we support puppies. And then it's like, I vote to amend. I'm going to amend by substituting and say, we hate puppies. And then it's like, suddenly that's in front of us, and it's like, I don't want to hate puppies. Why are they saying to hate puppies? So anytime an amendment comes forward, you don't know where it's going to go. And the amendment had to do with marriage, and it was a delegate from Zimbabwe who came forward with language of changing the revised social principle that was under concern that said, within the church, so this is the language of her amendment, within the church we affirm marriage as a sacred lifelong covenant that brings two people of faith, an adult man and an adult woman, and two adult persons of consenting age into union with one another. Okay, so that was the amendment from the floor. And pretty soon someone spoke up as like a point of clarification and was like, if we adopt this language, does that mean the United Methodist Church defines marriage as only between four individuals? An adult male and an adult woman, and two adult persons. And the bishop was trying to clarify, and it's like, well, it's the language before you all. I don't have a vote on this. And so they're just the president. So again, there was about 30 minutes or 45 minutes where the Methodist Church did support like this weird polygamy of sorts. But that was amended. That was amended, and to language of an adult man and an adult woman, or two adult persons of consenting age, into union with one another. So that was the language that was adopted. And I'm trying to find this one thing, if I can find it. There was a speech by a delegate from Denmark, and he spoke a lot. There's also a delegate from Austria who spoke a lot, and his name was Stefan Schuckenflug. And the F-U-K was the end of his name. And there were a lot of non-German speakers who had a lot of giggles about Stefan's name. Okay, I'm not going to get it right now. But so Jürgen came up and spoke, and he talked about how there, like the language seems, it's not straightforward. But he brings up in 1784, when the first Methodists met in the States. And so right after the Treaty of Paris, right after we're no longer a colony, John Wesley sent over, so it's like figuring out how to be a church when we don't have a king. How do we be a church when we're no longer part of the Church of England anymore? So there was this conference going on in Baltimore called the Christmas Conference. And John Wesley sent over two people to help. And it was Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, and they were kind of the first superintendents in the United States. And he sent over this document called the Sunday Service, and it was his deep edit of the Book of Common Prayer. And he cut out a lot of stuff. He was an editor. He liked to cut things out. And but what he did in that process was he had two different marriage ceremonies. And he had one marriage ceremony for people who expect to have children, and another marriage ceremony for people who do not. And these are really brief. He cut them out in general. And then Jürgen also spoke about this, and even speaking for the amendment and speaking in favor of it, is how in Scripture, in the Bible, Jesus doesn't ever positively describe marriage. That he mentions it, he goes to the wedding at Cana, and he mentions about divorce in Matthew 19. He's talking about divorce, and that's when he quotes from the Old Testament, and there were about two, and a man and a woman, in these kinds of ways. And it's of thinking about scriptures for weddings, and how there aren't many really good scriptures about a marriage. It's not the focus. Pretty soon, or we read it recently on the revised. So it eventually passed. And the margins of passing for these stuff, the margins of passing for taking out the language that prohibited LGBT clergy was very wide. And one of those is that, again, like I said, in kind of the passing aside, is that the clergy pension plan was retired. I think that's the nice way to say it. And so I had a defined pension that wasn't spectacular, but it existed in this world. That's pretty good. And that was retired, and part of that is because of the liabilities on defined pensions just go on forever in a way. Because, and this is something I learned from my bishop, unfortunately, because he used to be on the pension board, and it's like there are some pastors who are 70 years old and they marry a 20-year-old. And it's the age of that 20-year-old is the age of that pension, which is really creepy. But it's just when you're doing that insurance stuff and the pension stuff, is like that's what the liabilities are, and that's how the liability laws work in the United States with defining it. So it was changed to the way it's changed is basically it's going to lower the cost to the local church in a dramatic way. And the other thing that is going to impact us is the whole budget of the United Methodist Church. It was cut by almost 45%. Dramatically in the church and supporting, and it will impact us on the level of apportionments and the level of our, the best way is like the church tithe, the local church tithe into the connection. So that will also change in the near future. But there were also some language around deacons, but that doesn't affect us as much. There were some other things that were happening in that space. My friend who I met from Hungary, who I spent a lot of time with, I want to share just a little bit about him, and then I'll stop and take a breather, and if you have any questions, you can give them to Brenda, and I'll try and answer them. If you have any questions after, I'd be happy to, probably not immediately after Sunday, but meet with you and talk about what it means. But so Bence is a pastor in Hungary, and Bence he grew up, his grandfather was a Methodist pastor, and his grandfather in Hungary in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s. And his grandfather even smuggled in Bibles under communism and would go to a forest on the Yugoslavia border, and they would pass along Bibles so that they could preach under communism. And at one point, it was the bishop, the United Methodist bishop, could not enter the country, and because they were communists, and the bishop lived in Switzerland, and there was a bar, and so the bishop couldn't go into the country, and because of that, they couldn't ordain new pastors, and they couldn't ordain new pastors in the church. And there was a point whenever there was a split in the church in Hungary, I think, and it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, of her life, of that whole moment, of being able, these people. I took a guy who was from the Congo to Target at one point because he needed to buy luggage, and he needed to buy a suitcase to go home, and he didn't speak any English at all. And so I spoke enough French to go with him to Target and to go on this way and to share with him. On our Uber, our driver was a refugee from Eritrea, and who had learned French in Malta at a Doctors Without Borders camp. And it was such a beautiful, it was the Pentecost experience of that. And I was so moved and touched by that. So I've presented a lot, I've shared a lot that's going on. I'll stay here, I'm gonna take a break, and if someone does have any questions, I would love to answer them. Written, again, I don't want it to be people given statements in this kind of way. The board is here, many of them are here in this kind of way and are hearing, and it's not the end of the story. And hopefully my takeaway for you all is that decision, a focus on that. And what we're left with is we get to make the decisions about who we choose to be an account. Yeah, it's instead of a defined pension, it's going to like an account-based system, so that we will be given money that can be invested in different funds in that kind of way. So it's a lot more like a 401k than a pension in that kind, or a 401b in those kinds of ways. So it's not all off, and I'm not going to be on our own, and it's not going to be like, farewell, good and faithful servant, you get nothing. But yeah, it's just a different thing, and part of it, I think the main reason is that liability issue, is that the liability was too big. It changed that pension, and again, we're going to be paying off until 2050 that, because of those creepy pastors who married someone too young, and that is okay. All right, so not a question, but thank you for the nice note.